You swing your legs over the side of the bed, planting your feet firmly onto the cold floorboards. To your conscious mind, this is an automated, trivial transition from sleep to wakefulness. But within the dark, pressurized chambers of your deep pelvis, an evolutionary crisis is unfolding. As your weight shifts, a cascade of mechanical forces shoots upward through your calcaneus, travels up the tibia, and collides with the head of your femur. In an anatomically optimized human, this kinetic energy would be immediately absorbed, reassigned, and neutralized by a massive, fan-shaped network of deep stabilizing musculature. Instead, your pelvis subtly tilts forward. The lumbar spine pinches inward to compensate, and a microscopic shear force is applied directly to your fourth and fifth lumbar vertebrae. You do not feel the cellular degradation occurring in this exact millisecond, but you feel its systemic downstream manifestation, a faint, dull ache in your lower back, a slight tightness in your hamstrings, and a profound, subconscious loss of structural stability. You are standing on a foundation that is actively collapsing. This is not another superficial internet health trend instructing you to practice generic morning stretches. Roll out your tissues with foam cylinders, or drink warm lemon water to align your energy. Those are cosmetic band-aids applied to a structural engineering failure. The modern human condition is defined by a silent, degenerative mismatch between our current sedentary architecture and our ancestral biological design. We have weaponized our environments against our own musculoskeletal frameworks. By spending hours suspended in the 90-degree hip flexion dictated by ergonomic office chairs, car seats, and soft couches, we have effectively placed our primary kinetic engines into a permanent state of ischemic hibernation. This continuous compression does not merely make your muscles feel tight. It fundamentally rewires your central nervous system's motor maps, erasing the neurological pathways required to maintain human equilibrium. To understand why your balance is decaying, we must look past the superficial mirror muscles and descend into the deep, evolutionary landscape of the human hip complex. Human beings are biological anomalies. When our hominid ancestors transitioned from quadrupedal locomotion to obligate bipedalism roughly 4 million years ago, our skeletal architecture had to be radically redesigned. To hold a massive upper torso, heavy skull, and free-swinging upper limbs perfectly upright over two narrow points of contact, nature engineered a master regulatory valve, the human pelvis. This bony girdle functions as the central transmission system of the entire body. Every ounce of force generated by your feet hitting the ground must pass through this pelvic ring before it can be distributed up the spine or outward through the arms. At the absolute center of this transmission system sits a muscle group that modern life has systematically deactivated, the deep hip rotators, anchored by the piriformis, the gemelli, the obturator internus, and most critically, the gluteus medius and minimus. These are not muscles designed for explosive movement or aesthetic display. They are highly dense sensory organs packed with an extraordinary concentration of muscle spindles, which are microscopic specialized nerve endings that continuously monitor changes in muscle length and detention. In an ancestral environment, where humans traversed uneven, shifting terrain, scaled rocky inclines, and sprinted laterally, these deep rotators acted as real-time hydraulic stabilizers. They fired thousands of times per minute, micro-adjusting the angle of the femoral head inside the acetobulum to keep the pelvis perfectly level. This constant sensory feedback loop did not just stabilize the joints. It fed vital spatial data directly to the cerebellum, the brain's balance control center, via the spinocerebellar tract. Today, that data stream is dead. When you sit for hours, the deep mechanical structures of your hips are subjected to uninterrupted, low-grade ischemic pressure. The blood vessels supplying these deep rotators are compressed, reducing the delivery of oxygen and vital nutrients while trapping inflammatory metabolic byproducts. In response to this chronic starvation, the body initiates a process known as adaptive shortening. The fascia, the dense, collagenous web wrapping around your muscles, begins to lay down chaotic crosslinks of tough and elastic scar tissue to lock the joint into its chronically shortened state. Concurrently, a neurological phenomenon known as reciprocal inhibition takes place. Because the hip flexors at the front of your body, such as the psoas major and iliacus, are held in a constantly shortened position, they send a continuous stream of inhibitory signals through the motor neurons of the spinal cord to the posterior chain, Your brain literally forgets how to turn on your gluteal complex. The consequences of this neurological amnesia are catastrophic for your systemic balance. When you stand up and attempt to walk, your brain requires the gluteus medius to contract on your weight-bearing side to keep your opposite hip from dropping. But because that pathway is asleep, the brain is forced to execute a dangerous kinetic bypass. It recruits the tensor fasciole lata, a small muscle on the outside of your hip, along with the quadratus lumborum in your lower back. This compensatory pattern means that with every single step you take, your lower back is forcibly compressed and twisted to pull your pelvis upward. Over the course of an average day of 10,000 steps, this microtrauma occurs 10,000 times, grinding down the intervertebral discs, inflaming the sacroiliac joints, and shifting your entire center of gravity forward. Your brain recognizes this unstable state as a profound, existential threat. The central nervous system's primary directive is survival, and to the subconscious mind, a loss of balance signals an immediate vulnerability to predators or catastrophic falls. To prevent you from collapsing, your autonomic nervous system shifts out of its peaceful, parasympathetic state and into a heightened, sympathetic fight-or-flight response. The adrenal glands are signaled to release steady, low-dose pulses of cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream. This chronic hormonal elevation keeps your systemic biology under perpetual siege, or resting heart rate elevates. Your digestion slows down, and your muscles become hypertonic and rigid as the nervous system attempts to create a stiff, protective arm around your fragile spine. The localized failure of your deep hip rotators has now escalated into a full-body systemic crisis, altering your blood chemistry, accelerating cellular aging, and leaving you feeling chronically exhausted yet structurally tense. To break this destructive cycle, we must look beyond traditional, isolated stretching protocols and learn how to recalibrate the neural circuitry of the pelvis. To liberate the human frame from this state of neuromuscular lockdown, we must deploy a precise, highly specific mechanical intervention that speaks directly to the language of the nervous system. This is the hip switch, a deliberate, closed kinetic chain neurological override that takes no longer than 30 seconds to initiate, yet triggers an immediate, systemic reset of your pelvic architecture. To understand why this brief movement possesses such transformative power, we must examine the microanatomy of the hip joint itself. The coxifemoral joint is a deep ball and socket structure, where the spherical head of the femur is deeply nested within the cup-like acetabular of the pelvis. Surrounding this interface is an incredibly dense capsule of ligamentous tissue, woven from the iliofemoral, pubiferal, and ischiofemoral ligaments, which form an anatomical screw-home mechanism designed to lock the joint into maximum structural stability when the hip is fully extended. When you execute the hip switch, you are not merely moving bone through space. You are intentionally manipulating the tension vectors of this ligamentous capsule to decompress the joint space. The movement begins from a seated position on the floor, with your knees bent at 90-degree angles, creating what biomechanists call a 90-90 positional matrix. In this specific orientation, one hip is placed into extreme external rotation, while the opposite hip is driven into deep internal rotation. This dual-vector configuration immediately exposes the deep structural imbalances that years of sitting have engineered into your tissues. As you slowly rotate the pelvis over the fixed anchors of your femoral heads without using your hands for support, you force the femur to glide posteriorly within the joint capsule, breaking the microscopic collagenous adhesions that have glued the deep rotator muscles to the surrounding fascial sheaths. This mechanical shearing force triggers an instantaneous sensory explosion within the proprioceptive network of the lower body. Proprioception is your nervous system's internal global positioning system, a real-time map of where your limbs exist in three-dimensional space. Inside the tendons of your deep hip rotators lie the Golgi tendon organs, specialized sensory receptors that act as biological strain gauges. As the hip switch stretches the shortened, ischemic tissues of the internal rotators, these organs detect the intense increase in mechanical tension. They immediately fire high-frequency electrical signals up the thick, myelinated type 1b afferent nerve fibers, entering the posterior horn of the spinal cord. Here, these signals synapse directly with inhibitory interneurons, which instantly order the chronically tight, hypertonic muscles of the hip flexors and lower back to stand down. This process known as autogenic inhibition, acts like a neurological circuit breaker, cutting off the continuous stream of tonic spasm that holds your pelvis in a distorted, forward-tilted position. Simultaneously, the opposite side of the movement forces the dormant gluteus medius and minimus to contract against the resistance of your own body mass. This intense, isolated activation sends a surge of excitatory neurotransmitters across the neuromuscular junctions, waking up the forgotten motor units that have lain dormant during your hours of desk-bound sedation. The brain is suddenly reacquainted with its primary lateral stabilizers. The long-broken communication line running through the superior gluteal nerve is re-established, and the motor cortex begins to rapidly rewrite its spatial maps, restoring the natural, protective firing order of the posterior chain. The systemic downstream effects of this neurological awakening manifest almost immediately throughout the entire human organism. The moment the deep hip rotators reclaim their structural duties, the quadratus lumborum and erector spinae muscles of the lower back are relieved of their exhausting compensatory stabilization work. The chronic, crushing compressive load on the fourth and fifth lumbar intervertebral discs is lifted, allowing these fibrocartilaginous shock absorbers to rehydrate through a process called imbibition, drawing in fresh fluid and essential nutrients from the surrounding capillary beds. As the lumbar spine uncoils and regains its natural, neutral lordotic curve, the mechanical strain on the thoracolumbar fascia is neutralized, instantly alleviating the dull, perpetual ache that plagues millions of modern sitters. But the transformation extends far deeper than mere structural pain relief. It fundamentally recalibrates your systemic fluid dynamics and metabolic health. Running directly through the center of the pelvic bowl, just anterior to the spine, are the largest fluid conduits in the human body: the abdominal aorta, the inferior vena cava, and the deep lymphatic trunks. When the pelvis is chronically tilted forward and bound by hypertonic musculature, it acts as a mechanical kink in these vital hoses. Blood flow returning from the lower extremities is sluggish, leading to low-grade fluid retention, cold feet, and venous congestion. Furthermore, the deep lymphatic vessels, which rely entirely on the rhythmic contraction of surrounding muscles to pump waste away from the cells, become stagnant, allowing metabolic debris to accumulate in the tissues of the lower limbs. By restoring neural balance to the pelvis via the 30-second hip switch, you remove this mechanical obstruction, instantly opening the floodgates of your circulatory system. Oxygenated, nutrient-rich arterial blood surges down into the femoral arteries, flushing out the ischemic tissues of the lower body, while venous return is accelerated, reducing the workload on the myocardium of the heart. The lymphatic system begins to drain efficiently, pulling cellular waste back into central circulation to be filtered and eliminated by the kidneys. This sudden optimization of fluid movement alters your systemic metabolic profile. Cells that were previously starved of oxygen and choking on their own metabolic byproducts are suddenly revitalized, experiencing an immediate upgrade in mitochondrial ATP production, the universal energy currency of life. Moreover, this shift from structural instability to absolute pelvic equilibrium signals to the primal centers of your brain that the body is once again safe and secure. The amygdala, the brain's emotional smoke detector, ceases its frantic signaling to the hypothalamus. The autonomic nervous system undergoes a profound, palpable shift. The sympathetic fight-or-flight drive plummets, allowing the parasympathetic rest and digest branch to reclaim dominance. The adrenal cortex halts its continuous production of cortisol, giving your endocrine system a long overdue reprieve. Your heart rate variability increases, a direct clinical indicator of a highly resilient, stress-resistant nervous system. Your breathing naturally deepens as the diaphragm, which is anatomically connected to the psoas muscle via facial bands, is finally freed from the structural distortions of a locked hip, allowing for full, efficient respiratory expansion. To truly appreciate the systemic scale of this reset, we must trace the structural chain reaction upward from the newly balanced pelvis into the complex neuroarchitecture of the upper torso and brains. 10. When your pelvis stabilizes, it immediately transforms your cervical spine and your eyes through a mechanism known as the pelvo-ocular reflex. In a distorted, forward-tilted pelvic posture, your center of mass is thrown forward, forcing your thoracic spine into a protective hunch. To keep your gaze horizontal so you don't stare at the ground, the suboccipital muscles at the base of your skull must chronically contract. pinching the greater occipital nerve and restricting blood flow through the vertebral arteries. The moment the hip switch levels your pelvic bowl, your entire spinal column stacks effortlessly. The suboccipital tension melts away, instantly freeing the pathway for the vestibular system, the fluid-filled semicircular canals of your inner ear, to align perfectly with your visual cortex. Your brain no longer has to guess where you are in space. The sensory conflict between your eyes, your ears, and your feet is entirely resolved. This profound alignment triggers an immediate optimization of our internal organ systems, specifically within the complex folds of our gastrointestinal tract. The human gut is wrapped in an intricate web of millions of neurons known as the inner nervous system, which communicates continuously with the brain via the vagus nerve. However, this neural superhighway is highly sensitive to mechanical pressure and structural tension. When your hips are locked in flexion, the descending colon, the cecum, and the loops of the small intestine are physically compressed against the abdominal wall, creating localized areas of sluggish transit and altered intraluminal pressure. This physical stagnation disrupts the delicate homeostasis of your gut microbiome. Beneficial, short-chain fatty acid-producing bacterial strains like Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus begin to decline, while opportunistic, lipopolysaccharide-producing inflammatory strains thrive in the low-oxygen, high-pressure environment. When you execute the hip switch and decompress the pelvic floor and lower abdominal cavity, you physically relieve this visceral crowding. The sudden restoration of normal mechanical motility, the rhythmic, wave-like contractions of the intestinal smooth muscle allows for optimal nutrient absorption and waste elimination. Furthermore, by down-regulating the sympathetic nervous system, you restore abundant blood flow to the mesenteric arteries, providing the gut lining with the oxygen required to maintain its tight junctions. This prevents the systemic low-grade endotoxemia that occurs when bacterial waste leaks into the bloodstream through a stressed gut barrier. Your body transitions out of a state of internal low-grade inflammation, allowing the immune system, 80% of which resides within the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, to stand down from a state of constant, exhausting hyper-vigilance. This decompression also profoundly alters the pressure dynamics of your respiratory system. The thoracic diaphragm and the pelvic floor are designed to work as a synchronized fuel pump system. As you inhale, the diaphragm descends, creating negative pressure in the chest to draw in air, while the pelvic floor gently expands downward to manage the intra-abdominal pressure. When the hips are locked and the pelvis is tilted, this pelvic floor diaphragm becomes rigid and dysfunctional, breaking the synchronization. The thoracic diaphragm is then forced to work against a locked floor, limiting your breath to the shallow, inefficient upper chest. By freeing the deep hip rotators, the pelvic floor regains its natural elasticity. The next breath you take after a hip switch is deep, diaphragmatic, and full, drastically increasing oxygen saturation in the lower lobes of your lungs where gas exchange is most efficient. This optimized respiratory efficiency completes the loop of ancestral adaptation, returning your biology to the state of effortless equilibrium enjoyed by our hunter-gatherer forebears. Human evolutionary success did not stem from raw, explosive power, but from unmatched endurance and structural efficiency. Our ancestors survived through persistence hunting, tracking prey across vast distances for hours on end under a scorching sun. This feat was only possible because their musculoskeletal structures operated at maximum mechanical efficiency, conserving every drop of metabolic energy through an exquisitely balanced pelvis. When you utilize the hip switch to clear the modern neurological interference from your hips, you are not inventing a new movement. You are reclaiming your natural evolutionary birthright. You are restoring the foundational human blueprint that allows the skeletal frame to remain upright against gravity with minimal muscular effort. The transformation culminates in a profound upgrade to your brain's cellular health and cognitive capacity. Every single time your foot strikes the ground with a stable, well-aligned pelvis, the impact creates a clean acoustic and mechanical wave that travels smoothly up the skeleton. This mechanical stimulation is felt directly by the osteocytes, the living cells entombed within your bones, which respond by releasing a surge of bone-derived hormones, including osteocalcin. Recent neuroscience reveals that osteocalcin crosses the blood-brain barrier, where it binds to receptors in the hippocampus, the seat of memory and spatial navigation. Here, It triggers the expression of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, essentially acting as fertilizer for new neurons and sharpening your mental clarity, focus, and emotional resilience. By fixing your physical balance, you directly fortify your mental equilibrium. You no longer have to accept the slow, agonizing decay of your posture, energy, and structural freedom as an inevitable consequence of aging. The chronic lower back stiffness, the shallow breathing, the persistent mental fatigue, and the systemic stress that define the modern desk worker's life are completely reversible. The biological user manual for your body is written directly into your evolutionary anatomy, waiting for you to execute its commands. It requires no expensive equipment, no hours of exhausting gym protocols, and no superficial wellness trends. It simply requires you to deliberately communicate with your nervous system using the language it understands, precise, targeted mechanical inputs. As you transition back into your daily routine, carry this new physical awareness with you. Remember that every hour spent locked in sedentary compression is an active erosion of your human design, and every 30-second hip switch is a revolutionary act of structural reclamation. By taking control of the mechanical axis of your pelvis, you stop fighting against gravity and begin cooperating with it. Your steps will become lighter, your spine will become decompression resistant, your internal organs will operate in uncrowded freedom, and your central nervous system will settle into a deep, unshakable state of calm security. Reclaim your posture, awaken your forgotten stabilizers, and walk through the world with the absolute balance of an apex biped.